Remember when British sandwiches were just food, not balanced, branded, or explained? Somewhere along the way, the fillings got safer, the portions shrank, and the logic disappeared. These were the sandwiches people ate without questioning them. Packed for school, eaten on factory floors, or made because there was nothing else. And number one is the sandwich most people swear never existed, even though millions ate it. Chocolate sandwich. The chocolate sandwich appeared in British homes throughout the mid-20th century, particularly from the 1950s through the 1970s. It was not a novelty item or an invented treat, but a practical response to availability and cost. Bread was always present, and chocolate was one of the few affordable, calorie-dense foods that could function as a filling. Its defining feature was simplicity. A bar of milk chocolate or a thin layer of chocolate spread was placed between two slices of bread without butter or embellishment. The purpose was not indulgence, but energy. Chocolate provided sugar and fat in a compact form, making it suitable for packed lunches or after-school meals when savory options were limited. Preparation required no skill. Chocolate bars were snapped and laid flat to reduce waste, while spreads were applied sparingly to ensure coverage without excess. The sandwich was eaten cold, usually at room temperature, and consumed quickly rather than savoured. It occupied the same role as jam or dripping sandwiches, differing only in ingredient. The chocolate sandwich existed almost entirely within the home. It was made by parents, eaten by children, and rarely discussed. It did not appear in shops or cafés because it was never a product, only a solution. As food culture shifted toward nutritional categorization and clearer boundaries between meals and treats, chocolate ceased to be considered an acceptable filling. The sandwich did not evolve, it simply stopped being made. If this was sugar used as fuel, the next sandwich treated fat the same way. Sugar and butter sandwich. The sugar and butter sandwich appeared widely in Britain from the late 19th century through the post-war period, particularly in working-class households where speed, calories, and affordability dictated everyday eating. It was most common before the 1960s, when sugar and butter were still treated as staples rather than indulgences. Its existence was economic, not whimsical. Sugar provided immediate energy. Butter supplied fat, and bread delivered bulk. Combined, they formed a reliable solution when meals were delayed, rationed, or unavailable. This was not a dessert replacing food. It was food within the logic of the time. Preparation was simple, but deliberate. The bread was buttered first to act as a binding layer. Granulated sugar was sprinkled evenly, not piled. Too much caused spillage, too little made the sandwich pointless. The eating experience followed a predictable sequence. An initial crunch from the sugar, followed by rapid melting as warmth softened the fat. This sandwich lived almost exclusively in the home. It was rarely packed for school and seldom discussed. Adults tolerated it quietly as necessity rather than preference, particularly during lean weeks. As sugar shifted from essential fuel to health liability, the sandwich became culturally indefensible and disappeared without replacement. If sugar and fat together defined survival logic, the next sandwich removed restraint entirely. Bread and condensed milk sandwich. The condensed milk sandwich became common in Britain during the first half of the 20th century, particularly throughout the interwar years and during both world wars, when fresh milk was unreliable and refrigeration was uncommon in ordinary homes. Its existence was rooted in preservation. Condensed milk could be stored indefinitely, required no cooling, and delivered both sugar and fat in concentrated form. When fresh dairy ran out or was rationed, condensed milk replaced it. Bread provided structure. Together they formed a dependable substitute rather than a treat. Preparation required restraint. The condensed milk was thick and slow-moving, spread carefully to avoid immediate saturation of the bread. Too much caused leakage, too little defeated the purpose. Timing mattered. The sandwich had to be eaten quickly before the bread collapsed under the syrupy weight. This sandwich lived almost exclusively at home and was rarely transported. It appeared most often as an improvised solution between meals or during shortages, rather than as a planned dish. As refrigeration became universal and fresh milk stabilized, the condensed milk sandwich lost its practical role and quietly vanished. From preservation and sweetness, British sandwiches moved towards substitution. Crisp sandwich, dry bread version. The dry crisp sandwich emerged most visibly during the 1970s and 1980s, particularly among children in households where both parents worked and self-prepared meals became common after school. Its logic was substitution rather than design. Crisps replaced absent fillings. Bread replaced plates. Butter was optional or unavailable. The sandwich existed because something was needed between bread, not because it was intended to be there. Consumption relied on compression. Pressing the bread fractured the crisps into shards, creating a dry, brittle texture that dominated the experience. Flavor mattered less than crunch and salt. The sandwich was eaten quickly, often standing, and rarely repeated by choice. This sandwich lived in bedrooms and kitchens rather than lunchboxes. Adults were often unaware of it or quietly disapproved. It was a private solution to hunger rather than an endorsed meal. As ready-made snacks and filled sandwiches became affordable, the dry, crisp sandwich disappeared. If substitution felt austere, the next sandwich turned leftovers into structure. Mashed potato sandwich. The mashed potato sandwich was common in Britain throughout the mid-20th century, particularly from the interwar years through the 1950s, when cooked food was expected to be reused rather than discarded. It appeared most often the day after a roast dinner, once the table had been cleared and what remained was expected to serve a purpose. Its existence was driven by economy and routine rather than preference. Potatoes were filling, cheap, and reliably available. Leftovers were not viewed as second-rate food. They were resources waiting to be reassigned. Bread provided portability and structure. Together, they extended the life of a meal that had already done its job once. Preparation was direct and unembellished. Cold mashed potatoes were spread thickly between slices of bread, usually already seasoned with salt, butter, or meat juices from the original dish. Additional butter was optional and depended on supply rather than taste. The texture was uniform and heavy, offering satiety rather than enjoyment. There was no contrast, only continuity. This sandwich lived almost exclusively in the home. It was rarely packed, rarely discussed, and never presented as an option. It was eaten standing between tasks and without ceremony. Its value lay in usefulness, not appeal. As portion control, refrigeration, and changing attitudes toward leftovers reduced the need for reuse, the mashed potato sandwich quietly disappeared. From starch reused as filling, British sandwiches moved toward fat preserved for later. Dripping sandwich. The dripping sandwich emerged during a period when meat was expensive and every byproduct of a roast was preserved. It was common from the late 19th century through the post-war years, particularly in households accustomed to stretching a single joint across multiple meals. Its logic was absolute thrift. Dripping captured fat, salt, and residual meat flavor from the roasting tin. When butter was scarce, rationed, or deliberately saved for other uses, dripping replaced it entirely. It provided calories, richness, and satiety at virtually no additional cost. In an era where energy intake mattered more than variety, this mattered. Preparation was blunt and unapologetic. The fat was allowed to cool and solidify, often stored in a ceramic pot or reused from the same tin over several days. It was cut or spooned directly onto bread, usually thickly. The sandwich was eaten cold, the fat softening as it warmed against the mouth. Salt was sometimes added, though often unnecessary due to the seasoning already absorbed from the roast. Texture defined the experience. The bread absorbed some of the fat, becoming dense and slick, while the center remained soft. There was no attempt at balance or contrast. The sandwich delivered heaviness and endurance rather than pleasure. This sandwich lived almost exclusively at home and was more commonly eaten by adults or older children who understood its purpose. It was not packed for school, displayed to guests, or discussed socially. It existed as routine fuel, not identity. As animal fats fell out of favor, refrigeration improved, and cooking practices shifted away from reuse. The dripping sandwich became culturally unacceptable and quietly vanished. If preserved fat defined survival, the next sandwich returned to sweetness layered on softness. Banana and sugar sandwich. The banana and sugar sandwich became common in Britain from the 1930s onward, particularly after bananas shifted from luxury imports to everyday produce, following improvements in shipping and distribution. By the post-war years, bananas were affordable, familiar, and routinely present in working households. Its existence reflected abundance rather than scarcity. Bananas provided bulk and softness, while sugar increased sweetness and caloric density. In an era before nutritional balance became a concern, combining fruit and sugar was seen as practical rather than excessive. Preparation was simple but not careless. Bananas were sliced directly onto bread, followed by a light scattering of granulated sugar. Too much sugar overwhelmed the fruit. Too little made the sandwich pointless. The texture changed rapidly as the banana softened and merged with the sugar, creating a dense, sweet filling. This sandwich appeared in homes and lunchboxes, particularly among children. It was filling, inexpensive, and required no cooking or storage planning. As sugar intake became scrutinized and fruit was expected to stand alone, the banana and sugar sandwich quietly fell out of favor. From sweetness layered on softness, British sandwiches moved toward condiments as structure. Salad cream sandwich. The salad cream sandwich emerged during the post-war decades, particularly from the 1950s through the 1970s, when bottled condiments became central to British kitchens. Salad cream, with its sharp, acidic profile, was widely available and heavily used. It was promoted not as an accessory, but as a corrective, something that could revive plain food. Its existence was rooted in absence. When meat, cheese, or vegetables were unavailable or being rationed across the week, salad cream added moisture and flavor to otherwise dry bread. It functioned simultaneously as filling, seasoning, and distraction, masking simplicity rather than complementing it. Preparation involved little restraint. The sauce was spread thickly, often soaking into the bread and weakening its structure. Texture was secondary to impact. Sharpness mattered more than balance. The sandwich had to be eaten immediately or not at all. This sandwich lived mainly in homes and adult workplaces, rarely in packed school lunches. It divided opinion instantly and still does. Some defended it as efficient and honest, others saw it as a line crossed. As expectations around fillings increased and sandwiches became more formalized, sauce-only constructions lost legitimacy. If a condiment alone could serve as filling, the next sandwich relied entirely on preservation. Tinned fruit sandwich, peaches or pears. The tinned fruit sandwich appeared most often in Britain from the interwar period through the 1960s, when canned goods became a reliable way to preserve food year-round. Tinned peaches and pears were widely available, affordable, and regarded as a respectable substitute for fresh fruit, particularly outside of summer months. Its existence depended entirely on preservation technology. Canning made fruit stable, sweet, and predictable, regardless of season or supply. For many households, tins represented security rather than indulgence. Bread provided structure when plates, bowls, or formal desserts were unnecessary. Combined, they created a quick, sweet meal that sat somewhere between snack and pudding, without requiring additional preparation. Preparation required speed and acceptance of compromise. Syrup-soaked fruit was placed directly onto bread, often without draining, either through impatience or habit. The syrup immediately began migrating into the crumb, softening it from the inside out. Structural failure was inevitable. This was not a sandwich designed to last. It demanded immediate consumption. Texture defined the experience. The fruit remained slippery and intact, while the bread collapsed beneath it, creating a contrast between firmness and saturation. There was no crunch, no resistance, and little balance. Sweetness dominated. Cutlery was rarely used, but hands became sticky, reinforcing its improvised nature. This sandwich lived almost exclusively at home. It was rarely packed, never presented to guests, and almost never discussed. It appeared during shortages, after school, or between meals when effort was minimal and appetite immediate. Children accepted it without question. Adults viewed it as expedient rather than proper. As refrigeration improved, fresh fruit became consistently available, and desserts shifted away from tins toward chilled and plated formats. The tinned fruit sandwich lost its function and disappeared quietly. From sweetness preserved in syrup, British sandwiches moved toward industrial efficiency. Fish finger sandwich, bread and ketchup only. The fish finger sandwich became common in Britain from the late 1950s onward, following the introduction of fish fingers as a mass-produced convenience food aimed at standardizing fish consumption. It gained widespread popularity through the 1960s and 1970s, as frozen foods reshaped domestic cooking and reduced the need for fresh preparation or specialist knowledge. Its logic was industrial reliability. Fish fingers were uniform in size, boneless, and consistent in flavor, removing uncertainty from both cooking and eating. Bread converted them into a portable meal. Ketchup provided moisture, sweetness, and acidity, compensating for the deliberately mild fish filling. No additional ingredients were expected or required. Preparation was minimal and repeatable. Fish fingers were oven-baked or fried, then placed directly into sliced bread while still hot. Ketchup was applied generously, often without spreading. Butter was frequently omitted, either through habit or because the coating already contained fat. The sandwich was assembled quickly and eaten immediately. Texture defined the experience. The crisp breadcrumb coating contrasted briefly with soft bread before steam softened both. Cooling occurred rapidly. narrowing the window in which the sandwich felt complete. Eating was efficient rather than pleasurable, reinforcing its role as functional food. This sandwich lived primarily in children's meals, school evenings, and rushed family routines. It was rarely served to adults as a primary meal and was seldom discussed or evaluated. It was accepted rather than admired, valued for consistency rather than skill. As expectations around meals expanded and sandwiches became sites of variety and customization, the stripped-back fish finger sandwich lost prominence. From factory logic and predictability, British sandwiches moved toward absence rather than addition. Jam sandwich without butter. The jam sandwich without butter appeared widely throughout the mid-20th century, particularly during rationing and in the decades that followed when butter was limited, reserved, or inconsistently available. It was most commonly associated with school lunches and rushed meals. Its existence was defined by omission rather than choice. Jam provided sweetness and calories, but butter, which normally acted as both flavor and moisture barrier, was absent. The sandwich existed because jam alone was considered sufficient to justify bread. Preparation was blunt. Jam was spread directly onto dry bread, often unevenly. Without butter to slow absorption, the jam soaked quickly into some areas while leaving others dry. Texture varied from sticky to brittle within the same bite. This sandwich lived primarily in lunchboxes and kitchens and became quietly associated with disappointment rather than indulgence. Children recognized it immediately as inferior to its buttered version, even if they could not articulate why. As spreads diversified and expectations around packed lunches rose, the dry jam sandwich became symbolic of neglect rather than thrift and gradually disappeared. If omission defined this sandwich, the next one relied on density instead. Corned beef and potato sandwich. The corned beef and potato sandwich became common in Britain during the mid-20th century, particularly among industrial and manual workers whose meals needed to sustain long hours of physical labor. It was most prevalent from the 1940s through the 1970s, when calorie density mattered more than presentation and lunch breaks were short, cold, or taken standing. Its logic was density. Corned beef provided protein, fat, and salt in a preserved, shelf-stable form. Potatoes provided bulk, warmth, and long-lasting fullness. Combined, they produced a sandwich designed to endure the day rather than please the palate. This was fuel, not variety. Preparation was rough and utilitarian. Corned beef was sliced thick directly from the tin, often unevenly. Potatoes, boiled, crushed, or mashed from the previous evening, were pressed onto bread by hand or spoon. Butter, if used at all, depended on availability rather than preference. Seasoning was minimal. Salt was assumed to already be present. Texture defined the experience. The filling was heavy, cohesive, and slow to chew. There was little contrast and no freshness. Eating required time and effort, reinforcing the sense that the meal was meant to last rather than be enjoyed quickly. This sandwich lived almost exclusively in packed lunches carried to factories, construction sites, and yards. It was wrapped tightly, eaten deliberately, and rarely shared. It was never casual and never decorative. As labour patterns shifted and lighter, faster meals became standard, the corned beef and potato sandwich lost relevance and quietly disappeared. From weight and endurance, British sandwiches moved toward contradiction rather than cohesion. Egg and sugar sandwich. The egg and sugar sandwich appeared sporadically in Britain during the early to mid-20th century, particularly in periods when food was evaluated primarily by caloric output rather than flavour logic. It was most often associated with households managing scarcity or stretching limited supplies. Its existence reflects pre-nutritional thinking. Eggs were recognized as sustaining and strengthening. Sugar was understood as fast energy. Combined, they were believed to provide balance, even if taste cohesion was secondary. This was not experimentation. It was arithmetic. Preparation was rudimentary. Hard-boiled eggs were chopped or mashed and sprinkled with granulated sugar. No seasoning, fat, or binding agent was typically added. Texture was uneven, crumbly egg against crystalline sugar, requiring bread to hold it together. This sandwich lived quietly and briefly. It was rarely packed, rarely repeated, and almost never discussed. Adults tolerated it as acceptable fuel. Children questioned it instinctively. As nutritional science advanced and flavour expectations hardened, the egg and sugar sandwich disappeared entirely, leaving no successor. From contradiction in logic, British sandwiches moved toward collapse in structure. Cold custard sandwich. The cold custard sandwich emerged as a byproduct of post-meal reuse, particularly during the mid-20th century when desserts were prepared in bulk and leftovers were expected to be consumed rather than discarded. Custard was not a treat made to order. It was cooked in quantity, poured into bowls, and left to cool with the assumption that it would reappear in some form the following day. Its existence was rooted entirely in aversion to waste. Custard had already been made. Bread was already on hand. The combination required no additional cooking, no fuel, and no money. It was not planned as a recipe, it was a practical resolution to excess. The decision was functional rather than appetizing. Preparation allowed almost no margin for error. Cold custard was spread directly onto sliced bread, which immediately absorbed moisture. Structural failure began within seconds. The sandwich could not be wrapped, transported, or delayed. It had to be eaten immediately or abandoned. This imposed urgency shaped how it was consumed. Texture defined the experience. The bread softened rapidly, losing resistance and collapsing around the filling. There was no crunch, no contrast, and no separation of elements. Only saturation. Flavor was secondary to the act of consumption itself. This sandwich lived only at home and only briefly. It was never packed for school or work and never prepared deliberately for guests. Its disappearance followed changes in portion sizing, refrigeration habits, and a shift away from bulk dessert preparation. From collapse and reuse, British sandwiches returned to foundation. Bread and butter sandwich. The bread and butter sandwich predates all others on this list and existed throughout British history as a complete food rather than a placeholder. It was common across all classes and eras, functioning as both a meal in its own right and an accompaniment to soups, stews, and teas. In many households, it was the default option when nothing else was prepared. Its logic was sufficiency. Bread provided bulk and structure. Butter provided fat, flavour, and satiety. Together, they met basic nutritional needs without excess or complication. It could be eaten alone, shared, or added to other dishes, hot or cold without losing purpose. Preparation was simple but disciplined. Butter was spread evenly, not thickly. Too little rendered the bread dry and joyless. Too much was considered wasteful. The quality of the butter mattered more than quantity, and the bread itself carried expectations of freshness. This sandwich lived everywhere: homes, schools, worksites, trains, and fields. It crossed class boundaries and required no explanation, branding, or defense. It was understood. It also functioned as a reference point. When ingredients were added, it signaled abundance. When ingredients were removed, it signaled scarcity. Every sandwich on this list exists because bread and butter alone stopped being enough. Taken together, these sandwiches weren't created for novelty or shock. They were responses to limitation: time, money, leftovers, and routine. Each one reflects a period when food was expected to work before it was expected to please. They didn't vanish because they were bad. They vanished because the systems that produced them disappeared. If you want to understand where these sandwiches were made, why they made sense, and what vanished when those spaces closed, watch the previous video. What killed Britain's corner shops? A loss we still feel.